If you're caregiving for a loved one with dementia, you're likely to be on an emotional roller coaster for years, with grief being one of the most persistent and even overwhelming feelings. Understanding that grief is an inevitable part of the journey and taking steps to process it can make the pain a bit more bearable. That's all up next on Still Time for Joy, where we share practical advice for weathering life's storms and inspiring stories of resilience. Hello, I'm Sandra Levine, host of Still Time for Joy. My guest today is Deb Hallisey, a caregiver advocate and certified dementia practitioner. Welcome to the show, Deb.
Hi, Sandy. Good to see you again.
So, grief, what an important topic. It is always a part of caregiving, but today we're going to focus on dementia caregiving. You have a favorite quote about when the grief starts. What is that quote and what does it mean?
So the quote is, grief begins the moment we're called to care for someone. It's something that we carry even when it's quiet. And that comes from a colleague, Suzanne White, from the Caregiver Warrior. And it just is another way of saying that grief is part of a caregiving from the very beginning to the very end. It kind of underlies it like a river. And it's important that we know that and recognize that.
Yes, it is part of the entire journey, but we often don't acknowledge it because the person we're caring for is very much still alive. And I helped my mom for more than 10 years along her journey and watched her slowly but surely over months and years lose all of her abilities to function the way she once did. And yes, this person is still in front of you, but they're changed. And this is known as ambiguous loss. It's loss without closure. Tell me more about ambiguous loss and dementia caregiving.
The person is still in front of you, but you are losing them little by little. It really comes out of when soldiers were lost in war and you never got the body back or anything. Like, there's no closure to that. And one of the things about dementia caregiving and this kind of grief is so often we're like, why did it happen? What could I have done differently? And those are just futile questions. There's no way of going back and changing anything that happened. And in fact, we can really drive ourselves crazy doing that, because when you're always saying, when did this start? How could I recognize it differently? That doesn't allow you to have any kind of closure and just accept the fact that you're losing this person as they are in front of you.
Yeah, it hurts your heart so much, and there really is not a lot we can do to stop the progression of the disease. So what is the best way to deal with the grief? I assume it's coming to acceptance, but how do we do that? What are some steps we can take?
I think the biggest thing is recognize it and naming it. You don't have to say, I have ambiguous grief, but just saying, thinking to yourself, this is so hard, and I'm grieving this. Like, just recognize it and admitting it is so important, because until you do that, you can't work towards acceptance. And acceptance is acceptance not just of the grief, but acceptance of the fact that this is where you are in your life right now. And probably the biggest thing is really reach out for support. I mean, certainly in a dementia support group, you can talk about it. And so I always found it really helpful to find other people in my life who understood and are going through the same thing. So whether it is in an on-person support group or online, or people in your life who know what you're going through, reaching out and just being able to talk about it is critically important to your mental, emotional, and physical health.
Yeah, I didn't really think to look for them when I was helping my mom, but now I've come to see many groups on Facebook and other social media platforms where dementia caregivers or caregivers with any type of an illness are sharing stories, giving each other tips, and you can see in what people write how tremendously helpful it is just to know that you're not alone, that other people are experiencing it, and the back and forth with giving advice of how one person got through what another person is struggling with can be exceedingly helpful. And it's free. So online support groups, in-person support groups, journaling can be very helpful. And people also often, and you and I have both done this, when you go through a caregiver journey, you might become involved in a cause and it helps you to process it. And it also, as you said earlier, it helps you to meet other people who are going through or have gone through the same thing.
Absolutely. And I think we don't even recognize it, but in taking those steps, acknowledging, looking for support, reaching out, you're actually helping yourself. You're being kind to yourself and helping yourself along what is a difficult journey.
Yes, being kind to ourselves is so important. And there's another type of grief I'd like to talk about, and it's called anticipatory grief. And often, as caregivers, we also are grieving the changes in our own lives. We love the caregiving work often. We want to do the caregiving work, but it also causes a total disruption in our own lives, and that can cause grief for us. Talk to me a little bit more about anticipatory grief.
Yeah, people, when you name that term, people always think that you're anticipating the loss, the death of the person that you're caring for. And certainly that is true, especially as you get to the end stage, hospice, whatever, when you know you're running short on time. But truly, anticipatory grief for caregivers really is something that you don't even recognize how much it's a part of your life, because you were anticipating a certain way of being in life at this stage in your life, and that is now gone. For a lot of family caregivers, it's the loss of financial security because they've lost their job or they are helping to pay for things, and their money that they were going to use maybe for a vacation is now going towards caregiving. So it really is kind of not just anticipating the death of someone, but the loss of all those things you were planning on doing and anticipating. And honestly, it's the grief that I most felt, as my mom's caregiver, because I knew my life would never be the same.
And you also lost your job because of your caregiving.
I did. And that was scary. At 58, that was scary.
That's a very big deal. And yes, sort of in an instant, we go from having certain responsibilities, certain free time, certain hobbies, certain ways we go through the day, and it really can completely change. And that's not easy.
And that's part of where the acceptance comes in and all the things we talked about for ambiguous grief, to find support, to, look for something that you can do that takes you out of the situation for a little while. Whatever is going to help you to work towards acceptance and not focus on there's no closure is really, really important.
So, Deb, I have to admit, I loved helping my mom. We shared some wonderful, tender moments. We shared a lot of really funny moments. There was also plenty of heartache along the way. But I also often felt very angry and very frustrated. What does that tell you when you work with families and you hear that they are very frustrated and angry?
It tells me that it's pretty normal emotions that you're feeling, and there's obviously something that happened that made you frustrated or angry. But what I also try and help them understand is that if something happens, and you may not even realize it, but it's a recognition that there's just one more loss for you or the person you're caring for, oftentimes those emotions of anger or frustration are actually grief underlying it. And if you can get to the point where you can say, okay, yeah, this was really frustrating that they left the house or whatever they did, hid their pills, whatever they did. If you can also say, but yeah, there's grief underneath this because that's just one more thing they can no longer do or that I have to take on. And just, again, recognizing that and being able to name it is incredibly helpful for moving, not even beyond it, but to acceptance.
So acceptance keeps coming up. That's part of the goal here. There's one more situation about dementia caregiving and grief that I'd like you to talk about, and that is grief relief. What is that?
Yeah, I was so surprised when I came across that, but it made sense to me. So grief relief, again, they mostly talk of it in terms of having someone that has passed, has died. There is grief at the loss of that person, but then there's relief because it's over. this overwhelming part of your life is over. And then there's just guilt that you feel relief about all this. But it's interesting because I actually felt grief relief when my mother moved into assisted living. I felt such grief out of taking her out of our family home because I knew she was grieving that. And so often there's a shared grief between you and the person you're caring for. And we need to recognize that and acknowledge it and validate it for them. And so my grief at taking her out, my grief at seeing her grief was hard. But by the same token, I was so relieved that I was not the only person responsible anymore. And then I just felt really guilty. So it may come up during the caregiving journey way before that person leaves your life.
There are so many complex emotions that go along with any kind of caregiving, but especially dementia caregiving. So just to review some ways you can help to deal with the grief, name it for what it is, get support, whether online or in person, do therapy if you can, journaling is wonderful, and find other people who are also going through a similar thing who can help you along the way. Well, Deb Hallisey, caregiver advocate and certified dementia practitioner, thank you so much for being on the show today to share all this great information about grief and caregiving.
Sandy, thank you for having me. I love what you're doing. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk to folks.
If you found today's show helpful, please share the information with someone who needs it and follow Still Time for Joy for more practical tips on weathering life's storms, as well as inspiring stories of people who have turned their pain into purpose. Please consider supporting the work that goes into producing the show on Patreon. Follow Sandra Levine Productions on Facebook and YouTube, and learn more at sandralevine.com.